Brian Horrocks is most famous for his exploits in World War II as one of the most successful British generals and being played by Edward Fox in the fantastic 1977 film A Bridge Too Far. However, he had a pretty eventful career in the First World War and its immediate aftermath with the Russian Civil War. With that, on to the video. He was born in Ranikhet, India in 1895 and was considered a pretty below-average student in his military college and likely would not have even been commissioned had it not been for the outbreak of the Great War. Horrocks was commissioned as a second lieutenant on August 8, 1914, where he was placed in command of 95 men in the Middlesex Line Infantry Regiment of the 1st Battalion in the British Expeditionary Force. By the time he and his men got to Southampton, his 95-man unit had increased to 98. With 3 others having snuck in as they were eager to see combat in France. Once in France, Horrocks would become respected by his men for sleeping in the mud instead of in a farmhouse. He would also take part in ruck marches to the point where he felt like he was asleep while walking from exhaustion, which I can tell you from experience that rucking at 1 a.m. definitely sucks. Anyway, he was an officer embracing the suck with all of his men in 1914, getting ready to meet the Germans in combat. He wouldn't last too long in battle, however, as on October 21st, during the Battle of Armentières during the Race to the Sea, his platoon was surrounded, and while defending the town of Maisnil against a German attack, Horrocks was shot through the lower abdomen and in the upper thigh, and therefore he was taken prisoner. Horrocks was immediately taken to a German military hospital where he was treated like total crap. The Germans relentlessly interrogated him because they thought the British were using expanding bullets, and they tried to claim that was a war crime. Also, they refused to change his clothes or sheets and denied him and a fellow officer basic amenities. Both had temporarily lost the usage of their legs and therefore were forced to crawl to the toilet, which caused Horrocks' wounds to become infected, and life to suck even more. Life for him would improve after his discharge from the hospital and transfer to a prisoner of war camp. On his way to the camp, he would befriend his German escort, which he attributed to their mutual respect that frontline troops would share. He was promoted on December 18, 1914, despite being in enemy hands. Horrocks often tried to escape, having many attempts throughout the war, with one instance seeing him coming within 500 yards of the Dutch border before being recaptured. He was eventually placed in a compound for Russian officers by the Germans in the hopes that the language barrier would hinder his escape attempts. Horrocks, however, used the time to learn the Russian language, and in the later part of the war, he was held in Holzminden prisoner of war camp. His resistance in captivity would earn him the Military Cross, which was awarded to him in 1920 and backdated to May 5th of 1919. Horrocks was posted to Russia as part of the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War, landing in Vladivostok on April 19, 1919. The White Army under Admiral Kolchak, with the help of the Czechoslovak Legion, had driven the Red Army out of Siberia, and Kolchak's Czechoslovak troops were returning home, and the British military contingent was urgently trying to replace them with Russians. To accomplish this, the British had only 2 infantry battalions and 2 small administrative missions, one charged with training and arming Russians with British war supplies and equipment, and the other with improving the White Army's communication systems. His first task, along with a party of 13 British officers and 30 enlisted guys, was to guard a train delivering 27 carriages of shells to the White Army in Omsk, 3,000 miles away on the Trans-Siberian Railway. The journey took more than a month, and as the only party member fluent in Russian, Horrocks had to deal with many of the difficulties they encountered. At every station, he had to ward off station masters intent on acquiring their carriages because 1919 Russia was pure chaos, and pretty much everyone was fighting everybody. While stopped in Manjwali, the British officer's presence provoked a duel between 2 Cossack officers. Horrocks accepted an invitation to act as a second in the duel, but the pair were arrested before the duel could take place. He managed to defuse the situation before it came to trial, by claiming his faulty Russian had been the cause of the misunderstanding, despite the fact that he knew exactly what he was saying. His next assignment was in Yekaterinburg in the Urals, where he was appointed second in command of training a school for NCOs attached to the Anglo-Russian Brigade. He found this post quite frustrating, having to dismiss nearly a third of the initial cadre on medical grounds, and they were struggling to get supplies and support from White Army authorities because Russia 1919. But despite these hindrances, he developed a good relationship with his men and an admiration for the White Army soldiers, but not necessarily for the cadre. Although British forces were ordered home shortly afterwards, Horrocks and another officer named George Hayes remained to advise the 1st Siberian Army. The White Army was in a great retreat, and Horrocks joined them as they fell back to Vladivostok, 3,000 miles away. He was captured by the Red Army on January 7, 1920, and spent 10 months as a POW again, where he narrowly survived severe typhus. The British government would negotiate a prisoner release, and Horrocks left Russia on October 29, 1920. After Russia, Horrocks would rejoin the 1st Battalion of his original regiment, which was now based in Cologne, Germany, during an occupation of the Rhineland, where he wrote he had a good time because due to all the hyperinflation of the German mark, the British Army and the Rhine were considered quite rich. He then followed the battalion back to the United Kingdom during the 1921 coal strike, and then to Ireland, which was embroiled in the Anglo-Irish War. His duties there included mostly searching for arms and dealing with ambushes and roadblocks, which he called a most unpleasant form of warfare. This was followed by a short period in Silesia, where the British and Italians backed the Germans against the Poles, who were supported by France. You see, France kind of wanted to keep Germany weakened in 1921 during the Third Silesian uprisings, and in some cases the British and Italian troops actively fought with the Germans against the insurgents, and Horrocks was present for that. Years later, Brian Horrocks would become one of Britain's most effective generals in World War II, and later on, while working in the House of Commons post-war, he startled Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and Nikolai Bulganin by greeting them in Russian, which he had learned as a POW. But his exploits in World War II are beyond the scope of this video. Did you know about Brian Horrocks' World War I and Russian Civil War experiences before this video? Who else do you want me to make videos about? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.